Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our today's webinar, Criminalizing Climate Displacement, hosted by the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Center, INA Center, at the University of Houston Law Center. My name is Karaman Hassan. I'm a research scholar, and I'm currently teaching climate change law at the University of Houston Law Center. I will moderate today's webinar with my colleague and our co-director of the INA Center, Professor Tracy Hester. The INA Center is pleased and happy to present an engaging webinar, a part of our webinar series, highlighting legal dimensions of sustainability, natural resource governance, and climate governance. So this session, titled Criminalizing Climate Displacement, features Professor Michele Okoh, a passionate scholar, clinician, and advocate at the intersection of criminal justice, environmental justice, and a public health policy. So currently, Professor Okoh is assistant professor at the Lewis and Clark Law School, where she teaches criminal law and criminal procedure and strive to bring policy-oriented perspective into her classroom. Her work exemplifies how legal scholarship can illuminate policy problems and guide us toward a greater fairness and justice. Before joining academy, Professor Okoh represented the state of North Carolina at both prosecutor and an attorney with the North Carolina Department of Justice. Later, through her own practice, Professor Okoh, she had a Okoh law firm. She advocated for the right of individuals with a particular focus on disability cases. She also gains a policy experience while working with the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business Entrepreneurship and with Honorable Alison Duncan of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Fourth Circuit. Professor Okoh receives her JD at Duke University and also the law school in the Duke University, and her MPF from George Washington University and BA from University of Louisiana. So in 2021, she was recognized with Rebecca A. Head Award for her outstanding leadership at the intersection of policy, justice, and science. Today, Professor Okoh will address a profoundly important and growing challenge, which is the criminalizations of the climate displacement. As you know, the climate change is forcing more people from their home due to floods, wildfire, and other catastrophic events. So Professor Okoh trying to fill the gap and tell us how legal guide us in terms of these very important and critical issue to our nations. So before we'll starting the webinar, if you have any question, please write your question at the Q&A box in the bottom, and me and Professor Hester will look after your questions, and I will share the CLE credit after the talk. So please join us to welcome Professor Okoh for a very interesting session, and thank you so much again for joining us for this webinar series.
Thank you for having me. All right then, so welcome everyone. Today I will be talking about criminalizing climate displacement, which is based on a paper that I am currently working on. So as we proceed, where this kind of starts off is this idea of criminalization being used as a tool. And I have this quote from Angela Davis: "Prisons do not disappear social problems. They disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when a human being contending with them are relegated to cages. So this is simply one of the examples of where criminalization is being used as a tool to address social problems that we have. Now, as far as our discussion today, I will begin by talking us through a brief introduction. I'll also briefly discuss the role of climate change, the history of criminalizing displacement through vagrancy laws, very briefly, the great periods of displacement and restrictions on vagrancy laws, and then, of course, I will conclude. So as far as our introduction, in my paper, I start off by talking about two particular incidences. One is in relation to the 2018 Camp Fire. And what we see in that regard is the relative displacement that occurred and the resettlement of people, in particular in Chico, California. Now, as far as these pictures, um, you see this first picture on the left is an aerial photograph of an evacuee encampment that was from November 19, 2018, and that is in the parking lot of a Walmart in Chico, California. And that comes courtesy of Josh Edelson from the Washington Post. And then in this second picture, you see an individual lying on a cement bench outside of Chico City Hall on January 14th of 2024. So as you can see, the displacement that occurred in 2018 continues. And part of what brought my attention to this project, I've been working on this project for a while now and have seen significant evolutions occurring as far as our climate within the United States, our policies in the United States, and also in regards to legal issues as well. So, one of the things that really struck me about looking at Chico, California, is dealing with a circumstance where there was this wildfire. And very recently, many of you are all aware, we dealt with the Los Angeles wildfires and considering what would be the consequences of this. So, Chico, California demonstrates a pretty good example of what could happen in that circumstance. So as of January 2025, the city of Chico was very much so waiting to be able to utilize the criminalization tool to deal with its houseless population. So for one thing, the influx as far as the population of Chico was very much so unexpected. And the 2018 Camp Fire, which is now understood to be a climate disaster, also coalesce with other circumstances leading to dramatic displacement. So, for example, there was an increased number of unhoused individuals that were settling in Chico due to the 2017 Oroville Dam disaster. And also this was heightened in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we see here is this significant displacement. But at the same time, one of the things that I was looking at was the difference as far as the discussion was concerned. So in the beginning periods of this displacement, we saw news reports that were really sympathizing with those individuals who were displaced due to the wildfires. But as time went on, what we saw is that sympathy beginning to wane and the characterization of this population shifting from seeing them as victims to essentially looking at them more as criminals. They became unwelcomed guests. So, for Chico, that this was very much so put on hold after grants pass. Chico, the city of Chico was trying to figure out ways to begin criminalizing these encampments. And very much so, the main tool that it was leaning towards, and is still leaning towards, is in regards to criminalization. But then also, I wanted to also discuss the other side of the United States, looking at hurricanes Helene and Milton, another recent climate disaster, coalescing in two back-to-back hurricanes that devastated the East Coast. So the picture on the left is debris from Hurricane Helene, and that's in Petersburg, Florida. And that's on October 8th, 2024. And that's very much right before the landfall of Hurricane Milton. You also see on the right, this is from North Carolina, the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. So you see significant destruction, devastation, and again, loss of homes. But the situation also in Florida is leading to another circumstance where we're seeing that familiar pattern. So initially, those who were impacted by Hurricanes Helene and Milton were seen very sympathetically. But now that they are left with their homes are destroyed and unable to resettle in where they previously lived, they are now seeing the impacts of criminalization. So that is kind of the familiar pattern that we've seen. And what you're seeing right here is where this is being characterized by extreme weather events that we recognize as climate disasters. So again, this is this very familiar pattern, and it has existed for quite a while through history. So where I first started off was when I was working on this project, it was before the grants pass decision, and I was writing it as a prediction of seeing increased criminalization in relation to climate displacement. As those two cases that I just shared with you demonstrate, this is no longer a prediction, but now we're seeing it as a reality. So in these particular images, you'll see on the left, that comes from the Library of Commerce in regards to the 1866 vagrancy laws. And on the right, you will see this image comes from Punch magazine in regards to the 1848 vagrancy law in London. And one of the things I want you to notice is this characterization. So on the left, this comes from the Reconstruction period. And you can see the characterization of this Black individual who was a freed slave being characterized as lazy and as a burden. You could also see here a similar characterization in London, where it's demonstrated that essentially those who are houseless, those who are struggling are being shown as a burden on society, while that's being contrasted with the happy familiar circumstance. But let's talk about the role of climate change, because that's one of the things that is very important in understanding in relation to houselessness. So, for one thing, we see this general pattern that exists, but this is expected to be exacerbated by climate change in regards to displacement. So, one thing I also want to highlight that this is not a value-based judgment as far as individuals who are part of our unhoused population. The thing that I want to highlight here is the dramatic change in the significance as far as the large populations needing to be relocated. And also the fact that since we do have information on climate change, while we do know that we're going to have large portions of the populations that will need to be relocated, we are also in a position where we can make plans for this. I also want to highlight that as far as talking about our unhoused population, it is not a clear dichotomy of those who are unhoused for reasons different from climate change. They are very much so related. So, for example, we deal with our houseless population who struggle with mental health and substance abuse issues. From a public health standpoint, we think of those as diseases of despair. And those also can relate to a causal relationship in regards to losing one's house, one's home, one's community. So, one of the things that we're also seeing is that individuals who are displaced are, from a public health standpoint, vulnerable to those diseases of despair, even though prior to the displacement, they may not have suffered from those, or even if they did, they are exasperated. Not only that, once you lose your home, it is more than just shelter. It is your community. It is your work. So that also puts these individuals where it is very difficult for them to get mental health treatment and also treatment for physical health conditions as well. It also makes it extra difficult to find employment when you do not have stable housing. So I just wanted to underscore that as far as not saying that there is a value judgment as far as one is more or less worthy of being addressed, but as far as underscoring, number one, the dramatic shift that will occur due to climate change and our ability to plan for it in advance. So very briefly, let's just talk about climate migration and why this is a very significant part of climate change. So just very briefly, I wanted to share what is human migration. So human migration is an adaptive response of last resort. This occurs when there are no other means of adaptation and government assistance is insufficient to meet immediate needs. Now, one of the things about climate migration, we talk a lot about climate migration as far as crossing borders, but a significant part of climate displacement is actually in relation to internal displacement. And that is where most climate migration will occur within country borders, which raises unique problems, but also is important to understand because that's one of the things as far as this paper and my focus will be. It will be on internal displacement within the United States, which I've seen as being an overlooked problem, one problem that hasn't been really characterized in the area of climate migration. So it's been reviewed from a disaster lens, but really kind of divorced from the relationship as far as climate change is concerned. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight is actually when it comes down to climate change, one of the biggest impacts in regards to climate change is expected to be on human migration. So we have to bear this in mind. And then not only that, we also already see a shift that is occurring. So for example, previously, the main driver of as far as human forced migration, it was in regards to violence and conflict. But now we're seeing that being overtaken by extreme weather events. So just for context, extreme weather-related events accounted for 22.3 million of newly internally displaced persons in 2021 alone. And it is predicted that by 2100, 13 million people in the United States will be displaced due to direct flooding and sea level rising alone. Now, just very briefly, I wanted to share some of the issues, some of the problems that exist. We see that there is really a lack of a federal program to address this issue. In fact, the GAO, Government Accountability Office, highlighted this, that our federal programs are not designed to address the complexity of community relocation. And our response currently is mainly reactionary as opposed to preemptive, where we could be planning in advance. And then we also see how FEMA is our default agency for dealing with these circumstances. However, it is a disaster relief agency. It is not designed to deal with slow-moving climate-related disasters. It's also not really designed to deal with long-term relocation. And then for context, I have this quote from the Natural Hazards Research and Application Center. Worse yet, instead of having their needs addressed in a timely manner, who stranded in New Orleans after Katrina were not so much assistants as they were policed, literally treated like criminals. They were confined to shelters under strict control. Later, they were transported, again under the control of law, enforcement agencies, and the military to over 40 states around the country without even having the opportunity to choose where they would be sent. So one of the things that really stood out to me is looking back at Hurricane Katrina and the problems that we saw in regards to resettlement in dealing with that climate disaster. And based on what I'm seeing, these problems that resulted during Katrina have not really been resolved in how we address these climate-related disasters. So just for context, Katrina is another one of those examples where we saw criminalization coming towards the forefront of addressing displacement. So just very briefly, I just wanted to highlight our response to climate migration. So under the Biden administration, we have had Executive Order 14013, and then also the report on climate impact on climate change on migration. And that executive order directed federal agencies to take steps to improve efficacy, integrity, security, and transparency of the U.S. refugee program. And also, it directed, at a minimum, to address collaborations with localities to respond to migration resulting directly or indirectly from climate change. And then we have this report, which was significant, but despite actually being directed to look into internal displacement within the US, that is not delved into this report. So again, we have largely the issue of climate displacement within the US being ignored, at least when it comes down to internal displacement. So I also wanted to talk about this area of the history of criminalizing displacement and the role of vagrancy laws. So, to familiarize you with a definition of vagrancy laws, I took the definition from Winters v. New York. This was also adopted by Papa Cristo, which I will discuss later. And what we see is vagrancy statutes are those statutes that allow the net to be classed at large to enable men to be caught who are vaguely undesirable in the eyes of police and prosecution, although not chargeable with any particular offense. So essentially, vagrancy laws are those laws that are designed to criminalize activities by those we deem to be undesirable. So, very briefly, it has a long history. So, the history of vagrancy laws started before the US was in existence with 14th century England. And we see there, again, them arising during a period of significant displacement. This significant displacement was caused by the Black Death, and those laws were known as the state of laborers. These laws were designed to limit movement of poor people. Then continuing, we see in colonial America, where we have these warning outlaws, where these laws essentially provided notice to those who were deemed to be undesirable that they needed to leave the locality. So by 1770, every colony had one of these warning outlaws, except for Georgia. And they were designed to push out and limit those who were deemed as having an economic burden upon the population. It allowed local governments to control who stayed within a jurisdiction and also to limit competition for jobs from these people who were relocating from outside of the community. It also limited services that were available to them because they were to be seen as being a burden to the community and competing with the community for those services. And then in post-colonial America, you have the Settlement Acts. And then during our Reconstruction era, you have the Black Codes of the 1860s. So one thing that stands out about the Black Codes is that many of you are probably familiar with the Freedmen's Bureau, which was tasked with resettlement of freed slaves, and also was supposed to be working against the Black Codes. However, we see when it comes down to vagrancy, actually, the Freedmen's Bureau was actually part of enforcing Black codes in relation to vagrancy. So some of this included, for example, in Louisiana, sharecroppers, if they did not, well, freed slaves, if they did not sign contracts for sharecropping, they could face criminalization in regards to vagrancy. So for the freed slaves, it was being used as a way to criminalize unemployment, which significantly impacted the power differential. Because you have a circumstance where these individuals were slaves, but at the same time were being forced to oftentimes work with the same individuals who had enslaved them. Also, a circumstance where you had societal norms as far as employment for women. So, in general, women were not seen as expected to work outside the home. But when it came down to Black women, that was a different expectation. And if Black women wanted to utilize the same expectation of work within the home, they could face criminalization through vagrancy. So essentially, the Bureau's policy was that individuals were required to find work and make contracts Otherwise, they can be seen as a vagrant. But then we have our next era, the Dust Bowl, another period of significant climate disaster. And we see a huge influx of relocation into Western states. And then in response, we see these anti-Okoh laws to criminalize those individuals who were relocating from areas impacted by the Dust Bowl into other areas, especially California. So those are some examples of great periods of displacement, but we also see those periods being marked with restrictions on vagrancy laws themselves. So let's take a moment to think about and discuss how the Supreme Court has addressed vagrancy laws. So really, when it comes down to addressing vagrancy laws, there are two large strands of jurisprudence coming out of our Supreme Court. The first one is this void for vagueness. Remember, I shared with you that language that was adopted by Papa Cristo. Well, that is a significant limit in regards to vagrancy laws because by virtue, they are expansive enough to really encapsulate these individuals that are deemed as far as being undesirable. So we see that as far as under Papa Cristo, and the law being struck down for being void for vagueness. We also see how, at the same time, you see a development of the other jurisprudence in regards to this doctrine of the right to travel. So when we look at the right to travel, the two main cases are Edwards v. California and Saines v. Roe. So in Edwards v. California, we see the connection in regards to our Commerce Clause. But then by the time we get to Saints, we really see the development in regard to the 14th Amendment and this right to travel. So really under the right to travel is protected an individual's right to leave and to enter another state. Also the right to be treated as a welcome visitor when temporarily in a state. And then third, also the right, if you want to become a permanent resident, you have the right to be treated as a citizen. So for all of these cases, they were really a response to these periods where we were seeing significant displacement and really restricting by the Supreme Court of the use of this vagrancy law to criminalize these individuals. However, we see very recently as far as a shift in that development. So we have vagrancy being defined as a tool for grants pass. And one of the things that's very interesting looking at the case of grants pass is that we see instead of focusing on really these due process concerns, it's being seen as a tool, like any other tool, to deal with the social problem of homelessness. And it really does very little to touch on this other existing jurisprudence. So where we see ultimately this continuing to lead is what I have shown you earlier as far as increasing criminalization. So unless the Supreme Court revisits its view as far as the void for vagueness, right to travel, which is all still good case law, we will see essentially continuing increase as far as climate displacement. And one of the things that really is important to note is when I'm talking about this displacement, I'm not just talking about moving across national borders, but within the United States itself, as far as a way to address this issue. Thank you. All right,
Thank you
and I
so
could go
much.
on, but I also want to leave some time for questions.
Thank you so much for presenting this very interesting and engaging topic. So, Professor Tracy.
Sure. And Professor Okoh, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. Before I jump into a couple of questions, first, we need to make sure that we say hello to the people who are sponsoring us. I want to let everyone know that this speaker series is under the auspices of the University of Houston Environment and Energy Natural Resource Center, where we've been hosting this speaker series for a while now under Professor Dr. Hassan's guidance. Second, the center focuses on the intersection of energy and environmental laws. Second, I also couldn't resist and didn't want to let slip by that your resume, while long and fascinating, and as Dr. Hassan pointed out, I just wanted to add at the end, it mentions that you directed a play and also are a big fan of horror and science fiction. So I think we're immediately simpatico. So with that, I did want to remind everyone listening in that if you have questions, to please enter them to the Q&A box. Also, Carmen, I don't recall, do we have the ability to also take questions by chat?
Yes, but like we don't have a questions yet, but
okay then. So just to kick the things off, but please everyone don't be shy. Number one, one thing that comes to mind listening to your description is that if you're dealing with an internal population that's been displaced by catastrophe and they are having to move, that one possibility against a prosecution for vagrancy would be a necessity defense. And I was wondering if that was something that you had explored in some of your papers so far.
Yes. So I haven't explored too much the necessity defense. I've really been focusing in regards to those constitutional limits. However, as far as the necessity defense, that is something that I've discussed more broadly in regards to areas in regards to displacement. So in general, one of the frustrations from the defense side is unfortunately, necessity defenses have a tendency not to be too successful when being utilized in court. I would say my understanding is there has been more success probably in other jurisdictions in the Ninth Circuit. But one significant barrier is in regards to exhausting other legal options, right, that may exist. So, one of the potential arguments there could be, well, why don't you just go to another place, right? Which then brings up the issue of why this right to travel is so significant. Because just to say, oh, well, go to another locality that may be more accepting of you, isn't going to be enough when we think about the importance of the right to travel. So I think a necessity defense is something that could be significant, but definitely I would think it's important to also highlight that in conjunction with these other protected rights that we've seen from the Supreme Court.
Excellent. In the same sort of spirit, and again, focusing on the interplay of legal doctrines and defenses against the context of internal domestic climate disruption and refugees. I was curious as well about whether or not there might be some questions about whether and how you treat domestic climate refugees differently from international refugees who want entry to the United States, facing similar displacement. Is there any possibility or risk that the two one will influence the other?
Oh, yes.
More difficult to deal with international migration if we have guaranteed rights or assurances for folks who are internally displaced.
All right. So yes, that would definitely be a concern. And actually that was kind of the genesis of this project.
Oh.
So where I started out was, I kind of saw a gap. So actually international scholars have written a good bit about dealing with international displacement that is occurring in relation to climate change, and also talking about the role of the US in that regard. But one of the things that I was seeing was that there was this gap that existed between the understanding that essentially this was going to be occurring on a global scale, but not really acknowledging that the US was going to have its own internal displacement that it was going to have to deal with. So part of that I'm exploring a little bit as well in a different project. So I'm currently also working on a book chapter entitled Everywhere But Here, really focusing on that gap. And it's interesting for I've been working on this project for a while, so I have to kind of recalibrate. So where I started off, I ended up going through all the different, our executive orders and in relation to issues in regards to refugees and asylums. And then not only that, looking at resettlement issues as far as parole and other temporary statuses. So what I ended up looking at is I started looking at this before actually the Trump presidency. So this is not even the second Trump presidency. So this isn't even including that. But every president has restricted migration in those categories. So, one of the things that I was really pulling out at there is the assumption that it could just be ignored that the U.S. is going to have its own issues with internal displacement is not going to be satisfactory if we're thinking about this on a global scale. Because what you see if you look at all these executive orders is technically the U.S. is not supposed to be putting its own interests before its international obligations, but at the same time, over and over again, that's what it does. And this is even before the second Trump presidency. So very much so, they're interrelated. But I think that that's why it's important to have this discussion, because if we're able to plan for internal displacement that is occurring within the US, then we're also in a better position to plan for how we're going to be able to address that globally. I think if we deal with that by the seat of our pants, then ultimately we're probably going to see criminalization both domestically and as far as what we see as far as migration internationally as well.
Excellent. This may be a fellow traveler question in that regard. Let's be honest. By putting a climate framing for the discussion, it really invites a risk of polarization of the discussion. I'm assuming that, for example, the executive order you referred to directing the preparation of the study for internal displacement has been revoked by the Trump administration. Is there a way to approach this issue in such a way that minimizes that potential risk? And if I could put in perhaps a more maybe unfair way, how would you make this particular argument to someone on the other side of the political aisle, someone who is a skeptic about climate change, but still facing the reality that we are going to have people who are going to have to retreat from coasts that might be facing sea level rise?
Yeah. So in that circumstance, I think it's important to focus on the fact that these are extreme weather events that are occurring. And not only that, there are definitely some issues as far as economic drivers. So one of the things that comes out when we look at these vagrancy laws is that there's a level of concern about competition as far as employment, as far as services and resources in general. So if I were to kind of take that framing, I may focus on the extreme weather event aspect of it. I think it's important also to look at the resource aspect of it and how, in all actuality, this is not a great way of managing resources. I mean, if we look at what ends up happening with these vagrancy laws, the idea is essentially to drive individuals who are undesirable to other areas. So if you look at this from a global, well, not even global, I'm sorry, a national perspective, federally, there should be concerns as far as how to go ahead and give these individuals resources so that they could actually be in a position where they can contribute to the economy, and then also to contribute to overall growth as well. Not only that, actually planning in advance could reduce what we're spending as far as resources. that need to be expended as far as services. Because at the end of the day, with these vagrancy laws, it's kind of a rotating gate. So a lot of times the individuals will be just, will be fined, right? So there are circumstances where they may not actually be face periods of incarceration, but even for those who do, this is going to be a short-term solution as far as they're going to be released. Then you have a circumstance where it's probably going to be harder for them to find a job because now they also have a criminal record. So I think a lot of it goes into a lot of issues that are just beyond just gravitating towards one political spectrum. I thought the focus on climate change was important because number one, as far as it gives us predictions, we can say that there's a plan as far as how are things going to go. And then also as far as, climate change is concerned, it also makes it more, I guess, predictable because I guess the pushback would be, well, these are just one-offs. This isn't going to happen anymore. That was one fire here, one hurricane there. But I think it's important to discuss that these are not one-offs, that we will continue to see these extreme weather events. And if we just deal with them piecemeal, we're only going to invite more problems.
Absolutely. To the extent that the disaster framing implies rare and disruptive occurrences, we just need to face that this is actually going to be the new normal. And as a result, plan strategically and systemically to deal with it. We do have questions in the QA, but I can't resist asking one last one. Obviously, some of the most vulnerable communities to climate displacement have also suffered historical discrimination and economic deprivation, which seems to invite that there's a natural overlay between protecting climate disrupted communities, but also civil rights and discriminatory or disparate impact analyses. I was curious if that is something that you might think about, what sort of 13th, 14th Amendment due process and other types of rights might factor in to some displaced communities' request or demand for assistance.
Yeah. So that is a significant challenge. So one of the things that we see with the civil rights context, there's a case, Sandoval, that really made it difficult to raise those, will be successful on those sorts of claims. So what we're seeing more is in relation to, as you described, these impacts that are occurring as opposed to overt racism. So part of the challenge that exists whenever we're dealing with it under the Civil Rights Act and equal protection, and even looking at due process, is that really establishing that pattern in itself is usually going to be not enough. You're going to need something more more intentional and something that is going to be more provable as being a direct corollary. So that poses significant challenges in itself. But I also wanted to kind of focus a little bit more on what you were saying as far as these communities that are impacted, because that is another area of my scholarship. I wrote about it some in my last paper, Forgotten Waters, where I was focusing on municipally underbound communities. So what we do see is, yes, communities that have dealt with discrimination are going to be more likely to be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And some of that is in relation to things like redlining. Also, municipal underbounding is very similar, except many of you are probably familiar with annexation into municipal boundaries. Well, you can think of municipal underbounding the opposite way. So avoiding including communities in municipal boundaries based. So the overt argument is that it's for economic reasons, but it also just so happens that these communities have a tendency to be majority Black. Another example for our Hispanic communities would be the colonias. But definitely the pattern of our history of discrimination affects where people settle. And these were generally in the areas that were less desirable. So, for example, a community that's at risk is Princeville, one of our first incorporated cities by freed slaves. And that one's at risk because individuals had to resettle in these low-lying areas that were already prone to flooding. So that history just continues as far as settlement is concerned and the likely vulnerability.
Wonderful, thank you. Carmen, you said that we had a question in the Q&A.
Yes, if you look to the Q&A box in the bottom, so you'll find we have I think 3 or 4 questions.
Okay.
If you tap,
I've got it. Thanks.
okay.
Sorry, my system is not cooperating with me today.
Okay, but before that, are you seeing my screen for CLE credits?
That may be my fault because I am expanding the screen to full, but yes.
Okay.
For everyone online, you should be seeing on the screen sharing with you the course number for this event for CLE purposes. If you can't see it, I'll just read it very quickly. The number is 174-282-221. There's also a Q code you can scan to also get access to the credit. All right, hold on. There we go. Sorry about that, because now, of course, I've lost the Q&A. There we go. All right, before I lose it again, Michele, let me read this very quickly.
Yeah.
We have 3 questions for you. Let me go ahead and I'll start with the first one. Vagrancy is slanted towards those who are in place, and vagrancy has such deep roots in Anglo-American law. What is a mechanism for empowering, acknowledging, or accommodating the displaced? Is it only federal legislation or a constitutional amendment?
Oh yeah. So I would definitely be in a position where I would like the idea of federal legislation to address this, especially since we're dealing about a cross-state borders issue. But also, you're in a circumstance where I think states can also address this by working towards interstate compacts as well as a mechanism so that they could have agreements as far as how they will deal with resettlement. That's one of the benefits as far as thinking about this in terms of climate change, since we could make those sorts of predictions. That means that states, even though they're not perhaps being currently impacted, they could look down the line and realize, wait, I'm going to be impacted by climate change, whether it be on the receiving end or the concerns about my population needing to relocate. So I think those could be some tools that could come into play as far as addressing the impending problem.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because obviously with interstate compacts, you also need congressional approval, which would be an
Mhm.
interesting exercise. The second question is not as focused on climate displacement, but larger issues regarding the unhoused, but still worth us talking, hopefully, with time permits. The question is, how do you balance the opinion in Grants Pass with a need to shelter long-term displaced peoples? As you said, in experience, there's an initial period of understanding, but then comes compassion fatigue. And having just spent 5 months next to the Tenderloin in San Francisco, I do understand where this question's coming from.
Yes, yes. And I, by the way, I appreciate your framing as far as compassion fatigue, because I think that is a very significant part of what's going on here. So, the thing about Grants Pass is definitely in relation to its framing. So, as opposed to connecting to this line of jurisprudence regarding vagrancy laws, it instead really frames it in an Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment framework. The majority opinion really highlights how that was kind of kind of felt like a strain to them as far as the justices were concerned. And there's some merit there as far as we're talking about essentially a circumstance where we're looking at before the punishment actually occurs, the cruel and unusual punishment, Eighth Amendment issue arising. So that at the heart of it is what Grants Pass rejected. So the good news based on my reading of Grants Pass is I don't think it forecloses the other issues that I brought up as far as vagrancy laws are concerned. So I think there are significant benefits as far as framing this issue as vagrancy as opposed to the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. For one thing, it definitely harkens, if we're talking about the political framework, it does definitely harken a lot more to a liberty framework in regards to addressing this issue. So I definitely think there's room to continue to ensure that the there are restrictions on vagrancy, but I do think we need to go back to those two lines that I mentioned as far as the jurisprudence is concerned, as far as void for vagueness and looking at that right to travel. And then as also, I guess, from a policy perspective, being in a position, because where we do have sound solutions. So one of the things that came up with Grants Pass, these justices were very concerned about the federal law and courts stepping in to deal with local issues and how to deal with a very local problem. I think especially when we look at the right to travel, it really brings that framework of understanding it's more than just a local issue. So also, if we're talking about what would look good, I think definitely putting forth more solutions for localities in the record as well. Because one of the things that came up was the Supreme Court was looking at this problem and essentially at a point where we don't have a solution. You're just forcing these localities in that, in particular, the city of Grant Pass, to not use a tool, but what is it supposed to do? What is a viable option? So I think shifting how we frame the issue legally and then also factually to propose some solutions would be very important.
Excellent. Sadly, as always, we have wonderful questions and comments in the Q&A box, but our time has expired. So first, most importantly, thank you so much for everybody for a wonderful presentation and discussion.